The following program is a co-production with EWTN and the Tim and Steph Bush School of Business and Economics of the Catholic University of America.
Hi, I'm Jay Richards from the Bush School of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America. Welcome to A Force for Good. This special show is dedicated to the life of one of Catholicism's brightest minds, Michael Novak. In the 1950s and 1960s, a popular type of theology developed in the Catholic Church. It was called liberation theology, and Michael Novak was no stranger to it.
If we had to summarize what he thought was sort of the big problem with liberation theology, he thought it misunderstood the path to wealth, the path to development. And it was a kind of paradox and something that was painful for him. Why? Because this culture of Latin America was so much influenced by the Catholic Church.
Liberation theology mixed Catholic theology with Marxist social thought. In the 1960s and 70s, it influenced the church throughout Latin America. Theologians such as Gustavo Gutierrez, Leonardo Boff, and Juan Luis II were its chief proponents. Gutierrez's book, A Theology of Liberation, became a widely read manifesto. Michael Novak was sympathetic to the movement's stated desire to lift up the poor, but he argued that its socialist ideas would never accomplish that goal.
Left-leaning governments drove their citizenry into poverty, and free societies led to the creation of wealth. And that was purely an empirical matter for him.
You couldn't find many theologians who would say that business was a good thing, and that our economy, that democratic capitalism, would be a good idea. He was the first person who then said, hold on a minute. He asked of liberation theology, do you liberate? Do you fulfill your promise? His answer was, no, you don't.
Novak demonstrated that these were feudalistic and mercantilistic economies. They were corporatistic in that to the extent that they had businesses, these businesses were either controlled by the government or were controlling the government. And this represented the antithesis of a truly free economy.
Another piece of this, which became really kind of pernicious, was a sense from these theologians and others who were participating in this movement of liberation theology that the reason why Latin America was left behind was a dependency, that they were dependent upon other countries, especially North America. And so Michael was interested in kind of getting to the bottom of it. In fact, what you see a lot of is a lot of his attention to kind of, let's just figure out if this is true. So how much investment is there coming from North America into South America? Are they big enough to kind of explain the type of massive dependency that the complainers are talking about? And you see him like picking away at these little numbers. He was convinced that we would uncover mistakes about facts if we looked into it carefully.
Novak showed in detail why liberation theology would only increase poverty in regimes that adopted its ideas. But bad economics was not its only problem. Liberation theology contradicted basic tenets of Christian doctrine.
The deeper problems with liberation theology were its Christology, its view of Jesus Christ as primarily a political revolutionary figure, its notion of history, which was very ultra-mundane. The kingdom of God comes into history not so much in the resurrection or in the church, but through the revolution, and its divisiveness, the proper biblical notion that God has a special care for the Anawim, for the poor, absolutized to a point where God has no care for anyone else.
The church's social thought really is actually founded in a kind of rejection of the Marxist socialist ideals. And people forget this, right? They think, they look at Rerum Novarum and they think, this is the beginning of Catholic social teaching and it's about the problem of the workers. And of course it is about the problem of the workers, but it's about the problem of the workers because Leo says, because there's a problem in the working classes, people are susceptible to believe the lies of the Marxists.
Argentinian Alejandro Chafwan, now a leading proponent of entrepreneurship and economic freedom in Latin America, lived through the heyday of liberation theology. He saw its effect on the church, on businessmen like his father, and on the people.
I converted, I went back to the church in that period of liberation theology. And I still remember the priest preaching almost hatred against entrepreneurs. My dad, from the bottom up, rose to be head of a business. I had to close my ears to the sermons. And so the true church is not this politicized sermon. It tried to recreate theology from the bottom up. So what the people will say, the people will make theology and decide what is sacred and what faith is. It was an incredible campaign. When he spoke about the promised land, it had Cuba. When he spoke about, saints, it had a gorilla with a machine gun lifting it up. So liberation theology in that aspect was like a Marxist interpretation of the gospel. Latin America is a perfect case that when you apply the ideas that Michael Novak creating incentives for people to be creative, to be entrepreneur, the Latin Americans have always prospered. They did so in the 19th century, Argentina, Chile, Cuba, they grew faster than Europe. But then when the ideas of socialism and national socialism and corporatism started to dominate in the mid-40s, Latin America began to go under.
For many years, Michael Novak did not just challenge liberation theology, he advocated an alternative that has stood the test of history. Enterprise, rule of law, economic freedom, and a vibrant civil society. These are the ingredients that have allowed poor nations to emerge from poverty in the late 20th century.
The development that we've seen in Southeast Asia, China, and India, and even some Latin American countries such as Chile, shows that there's nothing inevitable about staying in poverty, and shows to Latin American countries some of the very concrete steps they can take if they want to get out of poverty.
And that sort of empirical proof that Michael Novak paid attention. That's why his biblical realism is a good way to define his views. He realized, I want to help the poor, I have to liberate their creative capacity.
So I, as a young seminarian in the early 1990s, had to deal with liberation theology, really because I'd, in different classes, been assigned Gutierrez's Theology of Liberation. 3 different times, 3 different classes. And I thought, okay, I've read enough of this. I want to see something on the other side. Went to the library and found this book, Will It Liberate, in the section, and devoured it. Okay. But this was the 1990s. The Soviet Union was collapsing. This seemed like the debate ought to sort of wind down now that we see how this stuff happened. But I mean, Catherine, you're an economist. Why are we still talking about this? Why are we still talking about communism, and especially Christian theology using Marxist theory? Why is this still happening?
Yeah, so I guess I would think maybe it's kind of there's many confounding factors, but kind of 2 things come to mind. I mean, one is that when we think about politics and economics, it's true in both spheres. It's difficult to make tight causal arguments, right? And so people want to know what's to blame when things go badly, and they don't tend to ask what's to blame when things go well, right? So this is an interesting thing about human nature. When things are going well, we don't look for causes; we're just enjoying ourselves. And when things go badly, we tend to ask, kind of what's to blame. And so, so this is the first thing about kind of looking at causal arguments, for revolutions or for depressions or recessions and this kind of thing. So people don't look for these things, and so I would say this is on the one hand, and on the other hand, why are we still talking about this? You say, because there are people who have made it their job for us to keep talking about it. People who have an interest in trying to push these bad ideas, which essentially are atheist. They're against nature, right? They in some sense attack both the nature of God and the nature of man. They're kind of these materialist Marxist heresies have their basis both in atheism and in a kind of destruction of nature. And so, of course, there are people still around trying to push these bad ideas, and then put that together with the difficulty of making tight causal arguments for what's to be. And I think this is why, every 25 years or so, these things still come back and haunt us.
Well, and here we are. I mean, Andres, I'm thinking about Venezuela right now. I mean, here we are, one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America, have massive natural resources, and people don't have toilet paper. I mean, is this something that's particular about Latin America? Is there a particular temptation to these kinds of
I think
ideas?
so. Look, the issue with liberation theology is that it's purely run by a heart for the poor, not a mind for the poor, right? It's an emotional appeal. And the emotional appeals always go better if you blame the others for having to fix it or having broken it. And the emotional side is, of course, something that appeals to Latin cultures, Italy, Greece, Latin America, Spain, and so on, because it is an emotional argument. But now when something like in Argentina goes wrong, like in the past, or now in Venezuela, the question is, do we have leaders then who have a mind for the poor, to actually lead people out of that kind of poverty? Unfortunately, this is going to have to get a lot worse before it's going to get better.
That's ominous. I mean, Catherine, I'm thinking about just the contrast in Latin America between, say, Venezuela, of course, is really at the bottom, but you've got Chile on the other side of the continent that's doing fine. I mean, what's different about these two places? Why are they in such different positions economically?
Yeah. Well, it would be good to go back and talk about the Chilean experience and the various reforms and changes that were made over the. I mean, this is a long conversation.
What are the
a lot
key
to
things,
do with,
though?
Expanding and protecting property rights,
Yep.
right? Liberalizing many of the government-run programs like Social Security and the pension program, and letting private enterprise take care of a lot of these things, which are some of the things. I mean, the Chilean experience is a bit conflicted. I mean, we don't like to talk a lot about it because it took place in a climate of political dictatorship, and which is conflicted, and this dictatorship wasn't good in every respect.
We don't endorse that.
And so this is unfortunately one of the best examples of sort of positive economic reforms took place under a climate of lack of respect for human rights and dignity. So,
which is only a piece, of course. The economic reform is only a piece. I think one of the things that we have to look at, that Michael brought up, is that this is all a vision of conflict, whereas what we need is a vision of complementarity.
Thanks, guys. Catholics have debated the American experiment since it first began. Michael Novak returned to the question again and again during his career. In fact, it became an abiding theme in books, articles, and speeches during his final years. Let's take a look.
He did see this sort of gap between the concept of faith and the concept of reason. In fact, one of his books is called On Two Wings, and it's about the American founding and trying to explain that you couldn't have done it on one wing alone. It couldn't be just faith. It couldn't just be reason. The only reason the American founding happened and why it worked was because our founding fathers brought them together, and that's amazing and providential if you think about it.
Catholics have long debated the American founding. They've wondered if its mostly Protestant founders and ideas drawn from the Enlightenment fit with Catholic teachings. Can Catholics embrace the American experiment? Or is it based on flawed ideas which are bound to fail? Over the years, Michael Novak wrote often on this topic. This included a book he wrote with his daughter Jana about the spiritual life of George Washington.
My father very much believed that they were critically important, and in many ways, that is what inspired his spirit of democratic capitalism. As you look at many of the writings of the founding fathers, they talk about the fact that without the correct cultural and moral attitude, without this sort of base in the concepts of religion and principles, nothing would work. A democracy, a democratic republic, since that's actually what we are, would not exist and cannot succeed unless you have this sense of cultural and moral founding and understanding to bring you together and to respect ideas.
Novak believed the founding was not a child of the secular Enlightenment. It emerged from the minds of men who knew the Bible well and understood the human penchant for sin. It was this idea that motivated the founders to create a system of checks and balances. They believed that no one person or group could be trusted to hold unchecked power.
What is clear is that they have absorbed a great deal of biblical wisdom. They use biblical language. They use phraseology from the scriptures. And Michael pointed out that it's constantly being used by the American founders as a way of reminding themselves of some of the eternal truths that are contained in the scriptures and which they didn't want Americans to lose sight of as they were building and creating this new republic, which in many respects was unprecedented in human history.
Mike would not say that the American Republic was perfectly founded. Nothing in this vale of tears is perfectly founded. He was attentive to the Puritan dimension of all of this, to the communitarian dimension of all of this. He understood that whatever the effects of the Reformation on the majority of people who formed the American Republic in its earliest decades, there were echoes of medieval Catholic political theory.
So the American founders, Michael Novak liked to point out, took sin and the reality of human fallibility much more seriously than many continental European Enlightenment thinkers. So much so that they said we need to divide power because it's unwise to give sinful human beings too much power. When you plan for a society in which you assume that people are fallible and make mistakes, it leads to a greater appreciation of the importance of limiting government power and constraining power than if you take the view that human beings are ultimately perfectible in this world.
Novak did not see 20th century moral decay in the United States as inevitable, nor did he think it was the result of flaws in America's founding ideals.
It's not clear that there's some kind of hidden flaw that finally manifested itself in the 40s and the 50s. It seems better to say that what Washington warned about in the farewell address was beginning to be realized in the 40s and 50s with predictable consequences. But the phrase that he always returned to when people raised this criticism was from John Courtney Murray: they built better than they knew. And he would repeat that over and over again. They built better than they knew.
He's worried that Americans are going to not just lose track of what's uniquely American, but think that perhaps what is uniquely ours is something to be ashamed of. So he struggled a lot with this, and he wanted to call our attention back to the thing which he thought really was a kind of genius of America.
He used $1, and basically started to reflect on "in God we trust," and when one by one, with his gentle style and very learned style, speaking, and you see the love in his face for the American dream.
Michael Novak saw in the American founding providential blending of Judeo-Christian truths with moderate Enlightenment thought. That mix enabled the founders to create a system that was both noble and fragile. He argued that its system of democratic capitalism could only be sustained by a virtuous culture.
One of the things my father always emphasized was this idea of freedom and liberty are critical, and they are our founding ideas here in the U.S., but it is not freedom from restraints. It is freedom within a structure. The concept of American freedom is about being able to embrace ideas and being able to embrace your individuality. It's why entrepreneurship flourishes so much in the U.S. compared to any other country in the world, because we really do encourage striking out, doing something with your own mind, your own talents, but it does matter that what you do is not impacting or harming someone else. That has always been there since the founding and exists today, even when it seems like sometimes it's forgotten.
Andreas, I know you as someone from Switzerland. Yeah. I mean, you're a Swiss Guard, right, that has now lived in the United States for decades. But you told me that you and Michael had actually argued about this, that you had struggled with the American founding. I mean, tell me about both the argument and how did it turn out?
I did struggle a lot about it. To me, as a European Catholic, America was always presented in line with the French Revolution.
Right.
Therefore, I had very deep suspicions as to what America was founded on. And we had many afternoons of several beers or several martinis of fighting about it and having these arguments.
He was wearing you down.
But he actually convinced me that at the time, the American founders followed Catholic social doctrine more than many Catholics in Europe. And the reason for that being that the church actually was was still very enamored with a hierarchical system, kings, royal system. This is actually fought out today with Pope Francis trying to simplify the Vatican, which is still a monarchy, an absolute monarchy.
Sure.
The American founders were the first ones who had the freedom to actually act on this, and very different, completely different from the French Revolution, used the natural law principles of freedom and self-determination and so on And all the Catholic social doctrine principles, they used Aquinas, they used Augustine,
right.
To build this, what they call a commercial republic, which is unique, and it gives a unique opportunity in history. So today, from my perspective today and my knowledge today, I think that the American founders were in many ways in their thoughts more Catholic than their European Catholic counterparts.
Well, I mean, and this is, Catherine, you know, the same struggle is happening now. I mean, there are a number of Orthodox Catholics who essentially blame the American experiment on everything that's happened in Obergefell and Roe v. Wade, and it's as if it was sort of a poison from the beginning. I mean, what's happening there? And I mean, how do you think that we sort of reconcile the founding as Catholics?
Yeah, so I think that maybe the way to think about it is that, as Andreas was saying, that maybe the American founding was, as regards church and state and kind of the freedom for religious persons to kind of contribute to the vitality of the country and the vitality both in the economic and political spheres, that the founding and certainly some of the commentators have come after looking at this and maybe up till today,
right.
that if you look at these things in theory, sometimes America's been better in practice than in theory, right? And I think part of Michael Novak's genius and approach was to sort of think, look, to feel what's there and say, can we put some flesh on this? There's something really special about this. This is not like Europe. There's something really special. And he had a confidence and a really, deep love for this country. You know, these contemporary commentators on the American founding that seem to have lost confidence.
Yes.
I think that there's a struggle for the I guess we could say the patriotism in this country. I mean, American Catholics. Novak wanted to say American Catholics can love this country,
yes.
can love its founding, and we can look back and understand what they were doing better than maybe that they could understand, right?
Themselves.
These early Catholics.
Yes.
And that's a good thing for patriotic persons to do. And the church asks us to be patriotic, to love our country. So I think this is Novak's genius and something we can follow him in and have a lot of.
Yeah, I mean, he was a practical thinker. So rather than constructing a theory and then insisting it fit, he was willing to look at the sort of details of the American founding and how it worked out, and then develop a theory about it after the fact. And I think that's why he ended up where he did. Well, it's been great being with both of you. Of course, the three of us were all friends and mentees of Michael Novak and are shaped 3 of the thousands of academics around the world that were shaped by him. And so it's a blessing having you both as colleagues, and it was a blessing for all of us to have Michael Novak at Catholic University of America with us in his last year and a half or so on this earth. Thanks you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Jay.
All right. On February 17th of this year, Michael Novak passed away at the age of 84. He left behind siblings, children, grandchildren, hundreds of friends, and countless thousands of scholars and others who've benefited from his work. We've heard from just a few during this special episode of A Force for Good. I'm Jay Richards with the Catholic University of America. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.
One of Michael's favorite phrases from Catholic social thought was something that can be found in Centesimus Annus, is the subjectivity of the person. This related for Michael to this absolute commitment to the idea that within each person is this intensely unique possibility to kind of co-create with God, to come up with ideas and ways in which the human potential could be unleashed.
He would go back to that imagery and draw the analogy between God as creator and man as co-creators, collaborating with God in the ongoing creation of the world. This infuses our understanding of the world with a sense of dignity, or at least it ought to, that work has a dignity because it associates us with our Creator.
Novak was essentially a boy at play. He loved youthfulness. So many of his stories and anecdotes would be about when he was a kid, he was with his brother and they were playing sports, or they would go out to the fields. And it's that energy that you see, that optimism, the dynamism in a young person. That's what Novak saw was captured in Christianity. So youthfulness is a real virtue in Christianity. Well, this growth is a real virtue in Christianity. And this is more fundamental than commandments. It's more fundamental than structures or institutions. There's a life that's in Christianity, and it's been a creative impulse and a source of originality. And Novak really plumbs that. He gets to that.
Salvation is not a matter of 1 second and one determination. It's a daily struggle to fight against your demons, against your sin, and be a little bit better each day. And then he says, the same we have to do with political economy. And he lived by that. For him, the faith was something, I think, almost like his intellectual life, always there, always present, always giving a new light, but always being open to whatever God will tell you then. So he respected formulas, but did not live, I think, by formulas.
He wanted us to have a grounding in Catholicism, and this is the religion of our family and our family for a long time. But at the same time, he expected us to question it and say, well, why? Why Catholicism? Why religion in general? Why is this important? In fact, that's where our book, Tell Me Why, came from, was I had sort of a series of questions of, okay, I've now studied political theory and history in college, and I understand that pretty much in every point you bump up against the Catholic Church. But why does it really matter? Why am I supposed to show up at church every Sunday?
His ability to be present in so many different fields and to leave a legacy of not being afraid to try new things. Michael as an intellectual was the opposite of what people are told to do now. He didn't believe in branding. He didn't believe in silos.
If I could point to one theme as really foundational for Michael, it would be caritas, that distinctive love proper to God himself, which is diffusive, forgiving, creative, very much related to the theme of creativity in capitalism, this anti-zero-sum mentality that there's more and more and more that can be created and brought into being.
Who is going to be the one who educates the teachers, the priests, the professors, and the average person as to the true meaning of our freedom, of our potential to create, of our potential to be imitators of God, and therefore to show them that the economy is a force for good, that business is a force for good.